How has the Sudanese military managed to retain power since the coup of last October? What prospects does a popular movement opposed to the military rulers have for ousting them? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Khalid Mustafa Medani, who's joining us from Khartoum. Dr. Khalid Mustafa Medani is Associate Professor of Political Science and Islamic Studies at McGill University in Montreal. His research focuses on the political economy of Africa and the Middle East. He is the author of the highly praised Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa, published by Cambridge University Press last year, and is presently completing a manuscript on the causes and consequences of Sudan's 2018 popular uprising. He has also published extensively on civil conflict with a special focus on the Sudan and Somalia. Professor Medani, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rabbani. Thank you. It's a pleasure always to be on your show.
Thanks, Khalid. You're the first guest who we've had the pleasure of hosting twice on this podcast. And when we previously spoke in October of last year, it was in the immediate aftermath of the military coup in Sudan. And while little may have changed in the intervening months, much has happened. So I'd like to start with getting an overview from you of Sudan's leadership. General Abdel Fattah Burhan remains as head of the increasingly permanent Transitional Sovereignty Council, but he has apparently had a falling out with some of his chief associates, while Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdouk was forced out of power, then reinstated, and then resigned in November. So what is the situation today in Sudan's halls of power?
Yes, absolutely. You're correct, Mouin, to say that on the kind of general political level, it seems that not much has changed, but it's been an eventful 4 or 5 months or so. As your listeners may know, on October 25th last year, there was a military coup d'etat that was waged by General Abdel Fattah Burhan. The reasons were very clear to the Sudanese population. It really had to do with basically aborting the pro-democracy revolution that had been ongoing at least since December 2018. And as we spoke last time, I highlighted 2 reasons for that military coup that occurred. One of them had to do with the possibility, the real possibility of a transition to a full civilian democracy that was coming just a few days after that the coup occurred. That would have, of course, threatened the power of General Abdel Fattah Burhan in a couple of ways. One of them, it would open him up to prosecution for alleged war crimes in Darfur and other parts of the country. Another one, as I highlighted last time, was a committee called the Committee to Dismantle the Remnants of the Previous Regime, basically an anti-corruption committee, very popular among the Sudanese population, that began to really highlight the vast corruption associated with Burhan personally, but also the military and its relationship to the vast economic empire of the military, its corporations. Those were 2 very important factors.
That also relates to, let's call it, for the sake of simplicity, the old regime, not just their activities during the transitional period.
Absolutely. It really is entitled the Committee to Dismantle the Remnants of the Former Regime, by which we mean, of course, the regime of Omar Bashir, and particularly the ruling National Congress Party. Very important. The reason I highlight that is that recently, last month, the leaders and those members of that committee were imprisoned. They remain in detention. They are not released. They have been ironically accused of embezzling funds, even though there, of course, no evidence for that, quite the opposite. And so it's a very important aspect of the reasons behind this coup that is determining the politics of the country. And I know some of your viewers may not be too familiar with this anti-corruption committee, so I wanted to highlight that.
That would be great, yeah.
So we'll return to that as well. The important aspect in this period was the effort on the part of Burhan to basically camouflage this coup as somehow a correction to the pro-democracy revolution. And what he said publicly, if you recall, is that he waged this military coup in order to make a correction to the revolution, in order to kind of the usual discourse of preventing chaos and racial war in Sudan and instability. What happened, of course, and this is very key, is that the opposition continued, and particularly the protest against this military coup continued. He found himself in a position where he was essentially forced to bring in Hamdok. He had, of course, after the coup, immediately put the former Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok in under house arrest and dissolved the Council of Ministers and detained the most important politicians of the political parties. And then what happened during the interim between October 25th, when the coup occurred, and November 21st, is that there were a great deal of negotiations between Burhan and Hamdok, who was in house arrest, mediated by international actors, in particular the United Nations. And on November 25th, something remarkable happened that caught the attention, I think, not only, of course, of Sudanese, but the entire population, or rather the international community, and that was the reinstatement of Hamdok as a prime minister. That came, I have to say, as a surprise to the majority of Sudanese. They thought that he would hold out to have better conditions for full transfer to civilian democracy. According to Hamdok's calculation at the time, he felt that he had a good deal, believe it or not, that he would be given the kind of authority to actually complete the transition to civilian democracy. Of course, that did not occur. It was just a move on the part of Burhan to consolidate his military rule and use Hamdok as a figurehead, so to speak, in order to legitimize his rule. What happened is that contrary to the hopes of Burhan and even regional actors, the protests continued and became even stronger. Not so much targeting Hamdok in particular, but reframing the whole idea behind the pro-democracy revolution here in Sudan. And that is reframing it around structuring a new governance structure, rather than focusing on one particular leader, as the protesters here and their leaders articulated right after Hamdok signed this political declaration with Burhan, very importantly, that they were interested and continue to be interested in how the government and regime will be structured, how the state is structured, but not who will lead the government. Following his attempts to actually appoint people, technocrats that would implement his policies, that failed. Instead, Hamdok continued in his security forces to brutalize, kill, detain young people who were protesting. That was a really important problem for Hamdok, of course, because he signed this declaration. Another was that he was blocked from appointing the kind of individuals in government he wanted. Instead, Burhan went ahead and released and reappointed former members of the Islamist movements in the bureaucracy. Lo and behold, by early January, very importantly, Hamdok resigned.
But should I understand then that his resignation was as much the result of opposition by the popular movement as it was obstacles placed in his path by the military leadership?
Absolutely. As Sudanese say almost on a daily basis, al-shari bas, the street only. In other words, all of these developments, and I want to highlight here, are really being propelled by this consistent, remarkable protest movement. And we can talk about its details and its efficacy.
Yeah, indeed, I am very interested to discuss the protest movement. But before turning to it, if we now look again at the current leadership, who were the main players? Who do they represent? And what is the balance of forces within that leadership?
That's a central question, of course. On the side of the military, for those unfamiliar with Sudan, of course, it is led by something called the Military Council, or the Transitional Military Council. That was an outgrowth of a partnership agreement between military leaders and civilian leaders as far back as April 2019, partnership. Of course, after the coup, it is now the transitional military wing of that partnership that is, of course, dominating the politics and dominating the country. So on the side of the military establishment, it is the Security Committee of the former regime that makes up this Military Transitional Council. That, of course, is led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. And even more importantly, the deputy is a man by the name of Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hamiti, who is also the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, the most important militia in Sudan. That
a paramilitary force, in effect.
A paramilitary force that is increasingly getting regularized in terms of its relationship to the coercive apparatus of the state, wielding a great deal of power in Khartoum and playing the role not only of a security force, but also the role of the Ministry of Defense and even international relations. So Hamiti in particular is extremely important, and increasingly there is a rift, a power struggle, so to speak, between Burhan and the increasing power of Hamiti.
I was about to ask, should we see Burhan and Hamiti as rivals, as partners, as a bit of each?
We should see them as partners of convenience, so that in those moments when there is a kind of joint interest, a marriage of convenience, including most importantly, notably the military coup itself, there is no question at this point in retrospect that they both planned and executed the coup together. When it comes to their relationship to international actors and their alliances, we see increasingly a rift. Hamiti, of course, leaning increasingly towards Russia, for example, and Burhan returning just now from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia. And so as the political dynamics, especially the strength of the protest pro-democracy movement at the grassroots increases and is sustained, that is causing fractures and factionalization between the Sudanese armed forces and this paramilitary militia.
Right. And but just to be clear, Burhan is not only the titular leader of Sudan, he is also exercising effective power, even if increasingly challenged by Hamiti.
Yes, he's exercising effective power in terms of at the level of the executive, in terms of appointments, in terms of promoting the Islamists that were basically kicked out of power at the level of bureaucracy. So if you look at the appointments, let's say in the banking system, in the bureaucracy, the acting ministers, that's really important. But I want to highlight one thing that will give you, in a nutshell, his weakness. In addition, in contrast to the projection of great power on the part of Burhan, he has, as of yet, been unable to appoint a prime minister, a civilian prime minister, in order to give some kind of legitimate shield to his military coup. In addition to that, he's essentially been unable to appoint a civilian cabinet. All of the ministers, with very few exceptions, are actually acting ministers. And so he has not been able to organize a coalition, whether it is the Islamist movement that he's linked to, or even others in the civil society. And that is a great indication of his weakness and his lack of legitimacy. This, of course, I mentioned because in lieu of this problem, his lack of a constituency, of course, you have the militia leader, Hamiti, who's yielding power through basically two very core means. One of them is through sheer violence and repression, utilizing his rapid support forces to quell the protest in Khartoum and throughout, and through his vast wealth, mostly through the trade in smuggled gold. And so what we have is really increasing tension and power imbalance between Burhan and Hamiti.
Yeah. So, well, I was going to ask you whether, at least at the formal level, there still is a transitional process in Sudan. And judging by your comments about Burhan's attempt to appoint a civilian government, at least, at the level of appearances, there still is. And so just briefly, if I could ask whether Burhan's failure to appoint such a government, is that because of the veto power being expressed by Hamiti, or is it because the popular movement is basically preventing any legitimacy being extended to such a move?
That's a really important question because we're talking about the balance of forces. And the balance of forces, of course, we can talk about the security apparatus that we just spoke about. And the other, of course, key kind of balance of forces has to do with the power of the military vis-a-vis civil society. And so the main reason that Burhan has not been able to consolidate power, essentially it's because he has been unable to generate this constituency. So that has to do with the unified front of
Right.
groups in civil society. Now, this absolutely includes the grassroots movements, the Lijana Muqawama, resistance committees, but it also includes the professional associations and the political parties. And
Yeah.
so even though he has tried to draw in even members of the political parties who are notoriously, of course, always at odds, he has been unable to generate even that form of legitimacy and co-opt them into his government. He is standing in many respects alone, linked to individuals who harbor, of course, loyalty to the former National Congress Party and the Islamist movement.
So I mean, to put it crudely, the opposition to the continuation of the coup is so unified that there isn't even an opportunity for individual or party opportunism to break through that wall.
Absolutely. This is one of the reasons Hamdok had to resign. Hamdok, from my understanding, felt that he would actually be able to bring in at least some members of the political parties and civil society in his government to shore up his own power. He was unable to do that. And that's one of the main reasons he had to resign.
Well, let's turn then, Khalid, to the opposition. The opposition to the coup is being led by self-styled resistance committees that have emerged throughout Sudan since late last year, but you've indicated that of significant importance are also the professional associations and the political parties. So if we focus on the resistance committees, because I think the membership of the associations and parties is quite straightforward. But in terms of these committees, who do they represent, and what is your estimation of their strength?
The resistance committees are absolutely the central actors at this point in Sudan. And that has come through over a number of years. They have a great popularity in the urban areas and the rural areas. They grew out basically around voluntary associations in the urban neighborhoods that begin to enact or implement some services to populations here in Sudan and neighborhoods because of the deep economic crisis. I should say very quickly that they began really organizing in earnest as early as 2013 as a result of great violence meted out by the state security forces against protesters in Khartoum who were protesting cost of living issues associated with the lifting of subsidies on bread and fuel. That is really the organizational genesis of the resistance committees.
So it goes back almost a decade.
Yes, I mentioned that because as activists and resistance committees say, their revolution is cumulative. As we say in Sudan, there is a great deal of organizational maturity as well as political maturity. It's a process. That is the only way to understand their sheer popularity across not only different social spectrum and urban and rural divides, but also across gender, where women participate fully in the decision-making of these resistance committees and in the protests themselves.
So a very well-entrenched movement, in effect.
Very well entrenched. They were really the foot soldiers of the revolution when it began in 2018. It was coordinated, as you know, at the time by the Sudanese Professional Association as a coordinating body. And then, of course, the political parties, many would say, co-opted, so to speak, those organizations in the period of transition. Nevertheless, importantly, the resistance committees now have taken a different role. They have taken not only the role of organizing protest, but also the vision of a new Sudan. Including recently, late February, actually releasing a charter for the People's Authority, which essentially is a roadmap, a vision for a new Sudan, a new fully civilianly led democratic country. And so here you see organizational resilience and expansion across the country, from Khartoum to Darfur to the Red Sea, a real awareness of a revolution they call a revolution of consciousness, a wa'i, that's very important, and a real understanding of not only domestic politics, but also regional politics as they impact Sudan. It is a process of organization and education. And this is why they have been able to generate wide support, where at the moment, the majority of Sudanese actually support them and are looking to them as leaders in this political transition to come.
So if we should view these resistance committees as, in effect, the leading edge of the opposition to the military rulers, do they still consider former Prime Minister Hamdok as their figurehead? And do they still aim for a resumption of the aborted transition process? Or, if I understood your most recent comment correctly, have they transcended that and moved, let's say, beyond the arrangements that were put in place initially a few years ago?
They transcended that, Mouin. If you want a marker of when they transcended that, it would be November 21st, when Hamdok signed with Burhan to basically re-legitimize the constitutional declaration of 2019 that the majority of Sudanese, not to mention the resistance committees, feel has to be aborted and canceled because it aborted the main objectives of the revolution. And so It is at that juncture that two things happen. The resistance committees in general and the opposition here in general, as I said, focus on the structure of government and a really important new or newly framed objective, and that is al-Madaniyya al-Kamla, full civilian democracy. And sha'arat, the slogans change from tasqut bas, fall that is all, to al-Thalatha la'at, the three no's, reminiscent of course of the post.
It's the Seven Khartoum Arab League conference. Yeah,
you'll be familiar with that. And the reference of course is meant for a reason. And that is the three no's, no's to direct negotiation, partnership, and legitimacy to a partnership with the military. Here, the focus is no longer on Hamdok as an individual, but rather the focus is on not negotiating with particularly those members of the Security Committee that had violated the human rights lives of now millions of Sudanese through wars and detention.
And that's very significant because the transition was very much framed as kind of a partnership between the civilian opposition and the military establishment. But now, you know, given that they have effectively chosen to overcome the military and establish a full civilian government, how do they hope to achieve these objectives?
Well, that is the $10 million question, so to speak. And I don't think there's one conversation in this country that doesn't pose that question daily across the different social and political spectrum. Of course, a transition of this kind is difficult for a variety of reasons. But what the way that they're envisioning it is part and parcel and is laid out in this charter for the People's Authority. There are a number of different charters that have been issued by different resistance committees throughout the country. But in a nutshell, it lays out a roadmap for this transition. And that has to do with a couple of basic elements. And one of them, most importantly, of course, is to overthrow the coup of October 25th. The other very important aspect of this transition is to remove the military from its hegemony over civil society and politics, and that is to relegate them to perhaps a military council. It's still up to debate that delimits their power only in terms of defense and other security issues.
So soldiers back to the barracks, effectively.
Yes. Exactly. Soldiers back to the barracks, which is really crucial, a full civilian cabinet of technocrats and a legislative assembly that would have heavy representation of members of the resistance committee. So the roadmap is there. The transition, of course, has to do with the will of the people themselves. Right now, it is open to not only debate in terms of its finer points, but also it's open to others, signatories. The idea is to generate a wide consensus throughout the different regions and the communities that back this kind of vision in order to strengthen civil society opposition to the coup, which is a very deft way of understanding how to tip the balance against a military coup. That is determinant on two things: the increasing weakness, potentially, of the military and security apparatus, which is difficult, and also absolutely crucially, how international actors, regional and global actors, really help or hinder this process of transition.
Right. So if we were to zoom out a bit, since the October coup of last year, there seems to have been a renewal of conflict in some of Sudan's regions, most particularly Darfur and Bor Sudan. What is the background to these developments, and what is the current state of affairs in these areas?
Well, I'm really happy you mentioned the regional areas because one of the advantages of this grassroots movement, it's direct linkages to across the regions, including the resistance committees in the eastern states of Kassala and the Red Sea and Port Sudan, of course, and of course the resistance committees that are very prevalent, believe it or not, in Darfur itself. That engage only recently, a couple of days ago, as teachers going on strike for cost of living issues were beaten and detained in Yala, in southern Darfur. The background to Darfur's conflict, of course, dates as early as 2003 during the first war, where militias that were sponsored and financed by Omar Bashir and the former regime armed certain individuals and clans in order to perpetuate the war against Darfurians of different ethnic
and if I'm not mistaken, Hamiti played a key role in that campaign.
Exactly. The reason I mentioned that longer history is to make sure that we understand that both Hamiti, first, of course, someone named Musa Hilal, but later on, Hamiti around 2012-13 played a central role. And of course, there is, of course, General Abdel Fattah Burhan, who people may not be aware, also played a role in the Darfur War.
I see.
This long history is important because what is happening in Darfur, in such places as Jebel Moon, for example, in central Darfur, around the capital of Western Darfur, Al Junaina, is huge human rights violations, killings, sexual assaults of different kinds, and the displacement of people from their land. This is, of course, in the news outlets generally viewed in the context of inter-ethnic or communal conflict. That is not the case, Mouin. I can assure you, even members of the resistance committees in Darfur and even former governors of different states in Darfur have come out clearly to describe that this is really perpetuated by the militia, most specifically the Rapid Support Forces, for two reasons. One of them, of course, is to consolidate their power there. Another is because of the rich mineral wealth, gold, and I believe even uranium in Jebel Moon area. It is also reportedly aided, or RSF is aided by the Russian Wagner group that is involved in these kind of so-called security operations that affect these. So it's a proxy war that is really implemented by central authorities. There also are returnees of the Rapid Support Forces from the wars in Libya. These are mercenaries, as is, of course, essentially the RSF. And these are coming in there not only for reasons of gold, but also land. And so much of the conflict, the reason it's so severe, has to do with returnees who are hungry for, of course, over not only mineral resources, but land. So if we see that taken together, we have to understand that the central problem in Darfur really lies in Khartoum and the security forces and the military operations. If you want to talk about Port Sudan, and that's—
I was going to say, I would, on the Red Sea coast, it's probably a very different dynamic.
It's not so much different in the sense the resistance committees are extremely strong in Port Sudan. They have been part and parcel of almost all of the March of the Millions and different forms of peaceful civil disobedience. They're directly linked to resistance committees in Khartoum, Omdurman, and elsewhere, and they have consistently protested since, especially since the military coup, even more so than the first iteration of the revolution in 2018. The issue of Port Sudan has to do very much with a central concern here among activists and the grassroots movements, and that has to do with the looting of Sudan's wealth, and the Port Sudan being the main port in, of course,
being
Sudan,
exported through that port.
Being exported through that port, and it is linked to the geopolitics, or rather regional politics, where, of course, there is a huge scramble over Port Sudan on the part of the UAE, on the part of Russia, previously on the part of Qatar and Turkey. It is extremely geopolitically important, and of course, Hamiti hopes to use it to increase his wealth and power. And in doing so, just recently, a couple of days ago, he went to Port Sudan, and he was met with great protest by workers in Port Sudan and also activists there from the Bija ethnic group that dominate there, who are opposed to the selling of this port in privatization to foreign actors, believing, number one, it would lead to the looting of course, and smuggling of American or Sudanese wealth, but also they feel that it would displace and get them laid off from work in the port, which is a huge employer in the Port Sudan.
As often happens with privatized infrastructure. But now that you've mentioned that, Khalid, I think it's a good opportunity to move on to the regional and international dimensions, because these continue to play an important role in Sudan and in terms of the influence they've been exercising over the various leadership actors that we've been discussing. And these include, of course, Egyptian, Emirati, and Israeli support for the military leadership. More recently, as you mentioned, there was a visit to Moscow by the Sovereignty Council's deputy leader, Hamiti. What was the purpose of his trip to Moscow?
The ostensible purpose, which of course is grounded in fact, is, as you know, he arrived only a day before Russia invades Ukraine. So there's an economic reason for his traveling to Moscow at this particular time. And of course, there is a political reason. Economically, he wants to continue and to expand the trade of gold, and Russia, of course, is interested in gold. Last year, I think that they imported or took 30 tons of Sudanese gold, which is important. It plays a role in the gold reserves in Moscow that are important. Sudan is only one of the African countries that Russia imports gold from. So even though it may be a smaller amount, the gold from Africa in general and Sudan in particular is not inconsequential for.
Sorry, these are Sudanese reserves being held in Russia, is that right?
No, these are, of course, these are Russian, the gold reserves in Russia in the central.
So these are, this is Sudanese gold that's purchased by Russia then?
That's right. That's right. Okay. In addition to other gold from the Central African Republic, right, Mali, and other countries. Yeah. So that's a very important. In addition to that, of course, he wants Russia's continued support militarily. From the Wagner Group. So it is, in his own words, it was one to broaden and deepen the economic linkages with Russia and also their security cooperation, by which he means, of course, the training and, of course, the arms supplies from Russia to his rapid support forces that have been in Sudan, by the way, since at least 2017. So that's the economic linkages and the reason for his trip. Another very important reason that is extremely important for other regional actors is that Hemeti went to Moscow in order to outbid Burhan himself.
I was going to say there must be also a relationship with the internal power struggle in terms of these foreign relations.
Absolutely. Now you have, of course, Russia on one side, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and of course, the United Arab Emirates on the other side, and with Israel, of course, and the United States that is playing an interesting role itself. So the constellation of forces now is very important. That impacts the relationship between Burhan and the balance of power between him and Hemeti. Burhan increasingly close to Abu Dhabi, to United Arab Emirates, and of course, Egypt. Hemeti increasingly being alienated from those countries. And so it's his way of, in fact, threatening not only those who insist on supporting Burhan, but threatening, I would argue, the United States and even the European Union. In other words, if you isolate me, I could make a great deal of trouble with you with this alliance with Russia. And in response, Mouin, the reason your question is so important, yesterday, the United States sent a warning sign. And they quickly implemented from the Department of Treasury sanctions against the Central Reserve Police here in Sudan. It's not necessarily the most powerful actor in the coercive apparatus here, but it's a warning sign clearly.
Shot across the bow.
Shot, exactly. I was looking for that phrase. Yeah, shot across the bow. In other words, signaling to Hemeti that if you continue with this alliance with Russia, threatening our interests not only in the Red Sea, but now globally, that they have every full intention to target sanctions against him individually and his vast wealth. That, I think, is what everyone understands from that visit.
Right. So if we now transition to, let's call it the Burhan side of the equation, as you know, there's currently a tripartite meeting underway, I believe in Al Arish, between the Egyptian, Emirati, and Israeli leaders. Do we have any indication that Sudan is an item of interest on their agenda?
Sudan, I think the reason I explained its important geopolitical location, in addition to its vast resources, Port Sudan is very, very important for all of these actors. The actors you mentioned in Arish have all, as you know, engaged together in exercises on the Red Sea, which is a very important aspect of their security considerations in the region. I have no doubt that, as you know, the first and foremost reason for their cooperation, of course, is over Iran and their concern. So that, of course, unites them a great deal. And of course, they're concerned about the increasing rapprochement around the accord between the US and Iran over the nuclear agreement. That, of course, from their perspective, as you know, would threaten at least ostensibly Israel and the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, I think. So that is part and parcel of the overall meeting. Sudan then plays a really important role in terms of the geostrategic aspect of Port Sudan. I would also argue Sudan plays a very important role because of the specter of instability in Sudan. A specter of instability that would destabilize Egypt. Egypt is very concerned, and in doing so, of course, threaten the entire region, not only the economic and financial linkages. So prior to Al-Arish, as you know, there were very important negotiations in the United Arab Emirates, but brokered by Egypt.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what do we know about the initiative that's being hosted by Abu Dhabi?
What we know is really interesting. Increasingly, Mouin, the relationship between the Arab countries and Sudan, given the continued protest here, is increasingly complicated. The first initial, as you know, kind of relationship and policy of the Arab countries in general was to support Burhan and the military with very little, with some condemnation of the military and, some calls for resuming a civilian-led democracy, so to speak. But clearly, in the early stages, it was support for Burhan. It comes as no surprise that they prefer stability over democracy in the region, and supporting the militaries is not doesn't require me to tell you that, which is really important. But I think what is happening is that with
Sorry, just to be clear, so Abdel Fattah Sisi is promoting civilian democracy in Egypt and is joined by Mohammed bin Zayed in this ambition.
Civilian. I want to emphasize civilian-led. Civilian-led. Okay. Is very different again from a civilian democracy, and this is very important. A full civilian democracy versus civilian-led means it would be similar to the partnership deal that that occurred in 2019. The meeting, from what I know, I'm not privy to the insider kind of information, but clearly it was to kind of revamp the initial partnership agreement between the military and the civilian component. I think there is a great awareness, however, that instability in Sudan continues. And of course, everyone has been surprised at the strength of the protest movements and the fact that Burhan has been unable to deliver a kind of consolidated government that would secure the interest of these countries in the region. And so I think I'm pretty sure that's what the meeting was about. There also was a meeting in Saudi Arabia with Burhan, and that, like the one in the Emirates, was to try to generate financing for the central bank here to try to stem the tide, Mouin, of something I really should emphasize, and that is a deep, deep economic crisis that is really going to determine what happens in the future. Inflation of 400%, last month the floating of the currency exchange, a liquidity crisis where foreign currency is no longer available, and cost of living that is now beyond the majority of Sudanese in order to meet basic necessities. In fact, the resistance committees went out on an organized, rather, a large march that is associated with highlighting al-Maisha, or rather the cost of living conditions. So this is a central aspect. It's reminiscent of the latter part of Omar Bashir's regime, of a deep economic crisis that cannot but, of course, generate grievances across the board among the majority of Sudanese.
Picking up on the possibility of further grievances leading to potentially social unrest. We've talked a little about Russia. And as you know, there's been much talk throughout the Middle East and Africa as well about the potential impact of the Ukraine crisis, particularly with respect to the interruption of Russian and Ukrainian grain exports to the region. If we look particularly at Sudan, is this seen primarily as a threat to the country's ability to feed itself and the stability of the regime, or is it also seen as an opportunity for Sudan to develop its much vaunted agricultural potential?
I think a little bit of both. I think Sudan imports, I believe, 1/3 of its wheat, Egypt much more. I think Egypt 70%, Somalia almost over 90%. So all these countries in the region are affected. I think it's complicated. Wheat exports here are usually channeled through a couple of different companies that are linked to the regime, a part of the process of dismantling the remnants. But nevertheless, clearly the prices have gone up. That will affect and is affecting everyone. I think it's a larger story in Sudan, frankly, in the sense that the economic policies on the part of the Minister of Finance, who essentially was a former militia leader in Darfur, is increasingly forcing the Sudanese to try to finance their own, for lack of a better term, subjugation, in the sense that there are hikes on removal of subsidies on almost all of the basic commodities, including electricity, bread, fuel. Now, this is done in the context of no real policy of investing in the domestic economy, and also no foreign reserves to speak of. And so what we're seeing now is something that has to be taken together. In addition to the high price of wheat, what you have is an expanded parallel market. As I said, an inflation rate of 400%, really unheard of, even by Sudanese standards.
Sure.
That is really undermining the livelihoods. And so taken together, I think the wheat issue is really very important, but I want to highlight that there's unfortunately a number of other sectors in the economy. All of that is linked to economic policies that have little to do with generating any productivity from the vast wealth of Sudan. That are absolutely possible, but most would agree that that would not be possible because of the structure of the government and the military and security forces, absent of a transition to full civilian democracy based on a technocratic governance structure that is bringing people that are qualified to implement agricultural policy, industrial policy, monetary and financial policy. That is something to highlight, because in the previous government, despite its problems, there were some successes in this respect. Nevertheless, this can be seen clearly in the charters of all of the resistance committees and the political parties as well, an emphasis on the need to redirect policy or decision-making based on full democracy that is in a transition period headed by technocratic experts that are able to deal with these issues.
But so far, we haven't seen any moves by Sudan's rulers or economic elites to see this as an opportunity to further develop Sudan's agriculture.
No, maybe you can read a little bit of my book on Sudan chapters, if I can advertise.
Please plug, yes.
Yeah, good plug. I think it's important to understand the political economy structure of this government. And so the chapters on Sudan really look at the speculative part of the economy and the way that it is essentially a war economy, so to speak, in many respects, but also one that thrives in the illicit economy, not only illicit, sorry.
So not a structure that is conducive to the type of planning and investment that would be required for Sudan to look seriously at how it can become not only agriculturally self-sufficient, but also a market that could export to the region and perhaps beyond. Khalid, so thanks. Good to see you again. Not at all. But as a final question, Khalid, what is your prognosis for the coming period? How do you expect things to develop, or is a situation so uncertain that speculation, informed speculation, is not really possible at this particular juncture?
I think it's always difficult to predict a specific outcome and give a timeline. But I think going back to the history of this particular pro-democracy revolution, for those of us who are familiar with Sudan, or of course in Sudan, I think that there is a kind of a theme I always kind of emphasize in the elements of great success of the pro-democracy revolution, and that is the virtue of learning from the past. What is really interesting is that there is a careful discussion and understanding of making sure not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And one of that central mistakes has been this accommodation to the military and security forces, even in the context of intifadas that are, democratic transitions. And so what we're seeing now is a general consensus around the fact that the mistakes of the past, where there is an accommodation with the military, has clearly not worked. And so now there is a different vision, and that is a vision of state building from scratch, learning from the post-colonial history of Sudan, and having to really come to terms with what it takes to have a full civilian democracy, and what it takes to basically relegate the military to its proper place. And so if you look at the charters and all of the different proposals out, all of them are unanimous in terms of A, learning from the past, B, having a structure that's fully civilian, and also making sure that there is a self-critique on the part of the political parties that would actually unify the nation around a civilian consensus. So this is, I think, something that bodes well. In addition to that, I think it's clear that there is a great weakening and lack of legitimacy of the military leadership. This is why we see increasing coercion and violence. As I mentioned in the last program, weakening oftentimes is indicated by the recourse to violence. And the other element is really the international community. I think, I hope people listening will understand that Sudan is central to regional and international politics. And that is not always a good thing, but it's clear that the role of the international community is very important. And many, of course, here now are debating supporting targeted sanctions in order to support the pro-democracy movement. So I think that there are some positive elements for the future.
Professor Khalid Mustafa Medani, thank you very much for sharing your expertise and insight into Sudan's current politics and its democracy movement and these other aspects with connections. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure. It's an honor. Thank you, Mouin. Till next time.
Thank you.